Dear audience, I personally appreciate a lot that you're here and that you take your time to listen to this interesting panel on such a profound topic. I'm Joanne and I'm part of the 51st International Students Committee organizing this symposium. And besides that, I'm an international business administration student at the University of St. Gallen in my second year. Last summer, I had the honor to gain insight into the future product development of Zurich Insurance. Creating new products in this sector means preparation for future demand. This demand needs to be calculated to detail. Sustainability topics discussed in school suddenly got a price tag. Not only are those price tag calculations quite accurate, they are based on obvious developments which we experience every day in this life. What shocked me most is the concreteness of future calculations made by the insurance sector. On our project table of our Zurich Insurance projects, there were not only people working and growing up in the insurance sector. No, it was far more. It was a pool of scientists, knowledge, and expert fields from all backgrounds. This not only represented the collaboration, but mostly the concern and affection of all those different parties. This is the base and the beginning and the biggest need for collaboration. Active exchange and learnings are key to setting common ground frames to move on. This in particular concerns the role of the government. Now, I welcome you to gain more insight into this aspect of collaboration through listening to this panel. And now I hand over to the moderator, Professor Walls, the moderator of this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Judith Walls. I'm the chair for sustainability management here at the University of St. Gallen. I'm very pleased to introduce with us today three panelists from different walks of life, shall we say, all with incredibly good insights into climate change and how this is affecting people around the world. I'd first like to introduce our digital guest today, Vanessa Nakate. She's a climate justice activist from Uganda and also the founder of Africa-based Rise Up movement. Vanessa began striking for climate change in Kampala in January 2019 after witnessing droughts and flooding that devastated communities across Uganda. And she's now campaigning to highlight the impacts of climate change and especially climate justice issues that affect communities in Africa. She's been promoting some key solutions, for example, educating girls. In 2020, she was named the UN Young Leader for Sustainable Development, and she was also listed at the BBC's 100 Women of the Year and 100 Most Influential Young Africans. In addition, she's found time to publish a book called A Bigger Picture, My Fight to Bring a New Africa Voice to the Climate Crisis. We also have with us Ms. Florence Tendu-Melik. She's the CEO of Zurich in France and also a member of the Zurich Group leadership team. She has 20 years of experience in financial services across Europe and Asia. And she started her career at McKinsey, later also working for AXA and Hiscox or Lloyd's of London, where she held numerous top executive positions. She graduated with honors from HEC Paris, and she has an MBA from Harvard Business School, and now also lectures a class on macroeconomics and global risks at HEC in Paris. In 2021, she was awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre National de Mérite, or the Knight of the Merit Order of the French Republic. She was also named CEO of the Year in Insurance in the UK and France. Previously, she's been awarded the Global Rising Talent by the Women's Forum and ranked 6th as the women in the top 100 new economic leaders in France. Last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Sashi Tharoor. He is a third-term member of parliament of Lok Sabha from Tiruvananthapuram. Excuse me, I did practice that, but clearly not enough. He chairs the Parliament Standing Committee on Information Technology and is the best-selling author of 23 books, both fiction and non-fiction. He's the former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and also the former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India. He's won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, or the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. And in 2019, he was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award in English Nonfiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. So thank you all three panelists for being here today. I would like each of the panelists to invite them to do an opening statement of about 2 to 3 minutes. And Vanessa, we would like to start with you if possible.
Thank you so much. Very happy to speak with all of you today. My name is Vanessa Nangati, and I'm a climate justice activist from Kampala, Uganda. I work with a group of activists, the Rise Up Movement, and we work to amplify the voices of the different activists across the African continent. COP27 will be happening this year in Egypt, on African soil and African land. I've had many people say that this makes it an African COP. But what will make COP an African COP will be beyond it being in Egypt, but it will be about highlighting the impacts of the climate crisis on the African continent and also in all the regions that are suffering some of the worst impacts of climate change. Africa as a continent is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions, but we have seen some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis happening. We've seen the occurrence of floods, the occurrence of cyclones, droughts that have left so many people devastated. We saw the Eastern Africa drought that left over 26 million people with no access to food. We are witnessing a food crisis in West Africa that is also leaving millions of people with no access to food. We saw Cyclone Idai in 2019 that left more than 1,300 people dead and many more recorded as missing. We've seen the most recent floods in South Africa that left over 300 people dead. The climate crisis is something that is happening right now, not something that is coming in the future. At 1.2 degrees, it's already hell for so many communities. It's already hell for so many people. And as the global temperatures continue to rise and the weather patterns continue to change, we are experiencing loss and damage in our communities. And like we've said before, we cannot adapt to the loss of our lands. We cannot adapt to the loss of our cultures. We cannot adapt to extinction. No one can adapt to starvation. We cannot adapt to the loss of our identities. The climate crisis is leaving so much harm in our communities. That's why there is a need to highlight the impacts of this crisis as we head towards COP27, and to also put a demand for finance for loss and damage, a demand for climate finance for mitigation, for adaptation, for the vulnerable communities. We need everyone to rise up for the people, to rise up for the planet, to rise up for the most affected people and areas. Now is the time to put an end to fossil fuels, because we cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil, and we cannot breathe so-called natural gas.
Thank you, Vanessa. I would like to invite Florence, please, to make her opening statement.
Sure. Glad to be here with you today. And I must say that as an insurer, actually we are on the front row seat seeing the unfolding drama of climate change impacting communities day in, day out, elevated temperature, rising sea levels, natural catastrophes. To the point as well that we believe that this is probably the most existential threat this is currently posed to humanity. This is intergenerational, this is international, this is interdependent. We already see the dramatic economic consequences of this, but this is only set to aggravate if we take no action. In 2050, if we continue on the current trajectory, this means 18% economic loss globally. The number may seem difficult to appreciate, but I can tell you this is tremendous human suffering, loss of biodiversity, and economic impact. And clearly there will be no winners, although the outcomes affect different communities in a diverse manner. At Zurich, we are trying to embrace and address that issue in a holistic manner. Obviously, we do accompany our 55 million clients, both companies, corporates, but also people, through risk transfer. So that's the taking charge of the financial impact of those losses, but also, more importantly, through prevention and through risk mitigation. We also set ourselves to be 1.5 degree fit, but we are keen to press for change on all of our constituencies to make sure that they join us on that path to net zero through the way we invest, through the way we do insure, through the product and services we provide. Clearly, and I'm referring back to the topic of this conference, which is about collaborative advantage, if there is one topic where this is highly relevant, this is this one. This is this one of climate change, because we will need determination, vision, pace from all constituencies, governments, corporates, private individuals, as this is not only a green transition, this is a radical transformation of our economies and societies. And now we need more than ever, not words, but actions, concrete actions, individual and collective, to see the change that we need.
Thank you. And finally, may I ask Sashi, please, to contribute your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Judith. Well, I'm very pleased to be here with this very distinguished panel, and good to see the climate activist from Uganda was able to join us. We are today at a pivotal moment of human history, and I think it's important that we use an occasion like this to remind everyone, including ourselves, of the immense responsibility we all have, and this is about collaborating together. Well, the next generation is going to have to pick up the baton and run with it. Our failure to meet the objectives that my generation had set itself on climate change has left us today with not just a problem of a climate crisis, but also widening inequality and increasing poverty in the world, which has been exacerbated by the ravages of the COVID pandemic. On the plus side, I think we've made a lot of headway in achieving some sort of global consensus on the nature of the science of global warming and climate change and the adverse impact thereof. And this convergence is valuable because within many countries there have been resistance to these ideas. But what still remains to be acknowledged, I think, and I speak from a developing country that feels this point sorely, is the need for an acknowledgement, an acceptance, an admission of the historical debts owed by the global north to the rest of the world and to the children of tomorrow. Because today's crises of poverty, inequality, and environmental degradation were sadly set in motion by the processes of colonialism and of the successful development of the North, which nobody resents. We all applaud it, but that sense of historic responsibility is still missing. There's a corresponding institutionalization of inequity at a global level, which has to be addressed. The UN has a principle in the Climate Convention of common but differentiated responsibilities. We all have a common responsibility to deal with the climate crisis, but it's different. And the reason it's different, frankly, is there in history. A study by the Global Carbon Project has shown that 23 developed countries, which basically is the US, Canada, Japan, all of Europe, and Australia, which account for a total of 12% of the world's population, have historically contributed more than 50% of the carbon emissions over the last 170 years, during which time, of course, global average temperatures rose by 1.1 degrees centigrade. So when we speak about things like colonialism, we do also take into account, if I can cite my own country's example, of India having generated 27% of global GDP in 1700. The country gets colonized. By the time the colonists left, India's share had reduced to 3%. And if you look at other countries colonized by European countries, you'll find the same sort of story. Europeans, meanwhile, raised their share of global GDP from below 20% to over 60% cumulatively during the colonial period. The fact is that Europe didn't develop the colonies developed Europe. So to say that countries should not actually feel this difference is to deny the burden of historical reality. And that's why the failure of the wealthy countries to meet their promises, which they made, of channeling $100 billion each year from 29, I beg your pardon, the Copenhagen summit then, the COP15, was when they made that promise of spending $100 billion each year till 2020. Not one year has actually seen that number fulfilled. So we are looking at a situation where, sadly, there is a genuine change. Now, we do need to see, as a result of this, some commitment to global solidarity in fulfilling these problems, which will require a certain amount of financial contribution and a certain amount of transfer of technology, because green technologies are by and large a monopoly of the developed world, and the developing world is where perhaps they're needed the most. I'll stop there. There's a lot more to be said, including the particular challenges in developing countries with their marginalized populations, of being able to do the things required to be able to adjust the things that the global north wants us to do and keeps telling us to do. But it's not easy, and it's not going to be done without help. So while the global north grew and advanced, and the global south stayed mired in poverty, now the global north has discovered the environment and how important it is. They're doing wonderful things across the north. A fellow Indian here yesterday was saying how wonderful it is to be in a country where you can breathe the air. And that's not, unfortunately, true in most of my country today. So there's a lot we can learn from you, a lot we want to do with you. We'd like to follow you, but we need help. That's basically my message.
Thank you, Sashi. So immediately from the opening statements, we see some incredibly important themes coming up, resonating across the different parts of the world, across different sectors of society, whether it's business, NGO, and government. One of the challenges, of course, that we have is the inequality and the effect of climate change on different parts of the world. As we have been pointing out, the global north has been producing most of the climate-related emissions. But the global south tends to be the first to pay the price, if you like, or to see the adverse effects of these emissions. Vanessa, if I may turn to you on the topic of climate justice and inequality. I mean, you were, for example, notoriously left out of a picture. I think it was in 2020 when there was climate movement activists. And since then, you've talked a lot about making the voice, of Africa heard, for example, and be seen. What else can we do to ensure that the voice of the Global South comes forward in this?
Yeah, thank you so much. We know that, when we talk about the climate crisis, it goes beyond the rising global temperatures. We also talk about the inequalities. We know that those who are being impacted the most right now are the ones who are least responsible for the crisis. But we also know that while the Global South is on the front lines of the climate crisis, it is not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. We've also seen how many activists from the Global South haven't had the chance or opportunity to attend climate conferences and be engaged in climate conversations. For example, the most recent COP26 many activists from Africa couldn't access funding or accreditation or even vaccination, and they weren't able to go for the conference. So these are some of the inequalities that will really hinder us from getting climate justice. Because climate justice is not just about the planet, it's also about people. When we are to talk about what climate justice really means, we cannot remove the heart of the people from the conversation. We have to understand that not all climate action is climate justice. Not all proposed climate solutions are climate justice, because some leave out the element and the aspect of the heart of the people. So I think there is a need to listen to the people on the front lines of the climate crisis. There is a need to amplify their voices. There is a need to amplify their stories and their experiences. Because every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So there is a need to listen. And there is also a need to really define what climate justice really is. For example, someone may talk about tree planting as a climate solution. But if that tree planting means that indigenous communities are going to lose their land for those trees to be planted, then that is not climate justice. Someone may talk about electric vehicles, but if the manufacturing of those vehicles means that many children and women are going to go through extreme labor, many children are going to experience abuse to get the necessary minerals that are needed to manufacture these cars, then that is not climate justice. So one, we must listen to those who are on the front lines so that we get to understand the solutions that they need, the solutions that work for them, and to also define climate justice with an element that has the heart of the people in the conversation.
Thank you, Vanessa. Maybe picking up on some of these points from a business point of view and an insurance point of view, Florence, what are we really talking about here in terms of damage or cost or loss? I mean, you mentioned a huge figure earlier that I can't recall right off the top of my head, but it was something like 18% of the global economy would be risked. So what does that mean for the different nations in the global north and the global south? Where does the justice issue perhaps come into that?
Sure. So if we just look at the year 2021, the global insurance and reinsurance industry paid for 110 billion losses. And you have to contrast that with the global economic damage of natural disaster, which amounts to $270 billion. And by the way, that's 50 billion more than the precedent decade. So the difference between the two is what we call the protection gap, meaning that only 40% of the economic losses are insured. And let me tell you that this is not going in the right direction, because the economic impact of natural catastrophe is increasing by 5 to 7% year on year, which is faster than global GDP growth. So on an absolute and relative basis, the consequences are going to become much harder, especially as insurance and reinsurance is a finite capacity. We have seen that well through the recent pandemic. And by the way, you're absolutely right to mention that this is affecting disproportionately the most vulnerable communities. So the global truth is that 60% of the economic losses are not insured and have to be compensated for directly by individuals, by companies, by governments, or not compensated for with all the consequences this has in terms of livelihood or net worth of those people. So why is that? There are basically three reasons. The first reason is about awareness of risk. The second reason is about economic means. And the third reason is about insurance solution. So the first one is about risk awareness, and this is where we as an industry can certainly play a role in terms of educating. The second one, economic means, is much harder to address, and this is where we need to partner in particular with governments, because the brutal truth is that this situation is having a tremendous impact on the most vulnerable population, increasing the global divide. And the third one is about the ability to bring insurance solutions and services. This is where probably we need to look at new form of collaboration between NGOs, the local communities, the corporate world, insurer, reinsurer, and governments. My belief, at the end of the day, is that the solution is going to come through a multilateral approach, but with very targeted actions directed to those communities. And just to conclude with an example, which is what we are doing at Zurich in terms of flood resilience solution. And this is a multi-sector approach, but we are helping very specific local communities in developed or developing countries to move from a situation where we are helping them recover from those disasters to be much more proactive and build resilience and build that prevention capability.
Thank you, Florence. And Sashi, maybe from your perspective, kind of building further on this, I mean, you've had tons of experience in India. What is the outlook maybe a little bit for the next 10 to 20 or 30 years? I mean, you talked about before that we all need to be committed, but the history is different, and so we should allow, of course, for different countries to contribute in different ways to climate change.
That's right, and of course, every country's own story is different. I mean, India, for example, with 17% of the world's population, generates less than 7% of global emissions. By comparison, China, with 18% of the world's population, generates 27%. And the US, with under 5% of the world's population, generates 15%, and so on. So there are inequalities, even in terms of each country's contribution to the present problems. So if you look at, for example, at per capita emissions, India's is very low, but if you look at it in absolute terms, it seems like a big number. All of these things we have to worry about, but I think I'd rather focus on the social and environmental challenges for justice, as it were, of the increased vulnerability of marginalized sections of society who are living under great risk of disasters induced by climate change, which we haven't specifically talked about. And I must say that when you look at some of the things that we've gone through, that we've seen, for example, in my own state that I represent in Parliament, we've had some extraordinary flooding because of completely unexpected intense rainfalls. We've had in parts of the country increased dry spells. We've had exponential surges and heat waves and cyclonic events, droughts. So if you look at all this, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came up with a report in 2021, which I'd recommend to many of you. They say that droughts destroyed over 454 million hectares of cropland around the world. That's just between 1983 and 2009, just sort of a quarter of a century's worth. India lost about $87 billion just last year due to natural disasters, 2020, just as on tropical cyclones, floods, droughts. And this is according to the World Meteorological Organization that's studying this. Now, all of this, you ask what are the consequences? Well, if you look ahead, you're seeing consequences for food security of poor and vulnerable communities, because, of course, it's cropland that's disappearing. People don't have agricultural products to offer. You're seeing an impact on productivity. Again, there are studies showing that in the last 2 decades alone, 228 billion hours of human labor has been lost every year just for one reason alone, and that's heat exposure. This is a worldwide figure, mainly, of course, in the agricultural sector. There's an impact on health. I mean, people don't realize climate change actually has helped both the growth and the re-emergence of various serious global infectious diseases and vector-borne diseases, malaria and viruses that cause dengue or chikungunya, which are illnesses we're learning about in India because they're spreading, are carried by mosquitoes. And because of rising temperatures in the world, these mosquitoes are able to survive in wider areas. And they, therefore, spread the disease even farther than they ever used to before. Then you've got, of course, smoke and air pollutants, which are man-made, and not to be blamed with climate change, but part of the problem. China reported 5 million new disaster displacements in 2020, and India 4 million. And this is now the World Migration Report 2022. So I've got all this data in front of me simply to show you the scale of the problem. And because of these numbers, I think it's incredibly important to understand that this is not just a theoretical thing, it's not about temperatures alone, it's having an impact that cuts across a rather wide range of human activity, and inevitably the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized are the biggest victims of it.
Thank you. Indeed, in fact, the mosquito population is also spreading even to Europe, and predictions say that with warmer temperatures, we will also start receiving some of these diseases that we are not used to. So,
I mean, Napoleon discovered malaria for the first time in Italy.
Right.
It's eradicated now. It might come back.
Yeah. So, you know, it seems pretty clear that a lot of these disasters and other effects of climate change are already here. Vanessa, earlier you talked about that climate adaptation is not the right way to go because we really need to mitigate climate change. But if a lot of these effects are already here for climate adaptation, is there any kind of adaptation that we should focus on as well as mitigation?
I didn't say that climate adaptation is not important. I think that mitigation, adaptation is all important. And we know that $100 billion was promised, to vulnerable nations as climate finance, but it has not yet begun. So that's why there is a need for climate finance for adaptation, for mitigation, and also for loss and damage, because the climate crisis is pushing people to a place whereby they cannot adapt anymore. We know that there are adaptation measures that can help people cope with the challenges of the climate crisis. Be it improving their health systems, be it improving how they grow their food in order to adapt to droughts or to adapt to floods, or being able to have adaptation measures to reduce on the flooding in their communities. But then there is a place whereby you cannot adapt anymore, and that is the place we call loss and damage, where communities cannot adapt to the loss of their cultures, where communities cannot adapt to starvation. We saw the Eastern Africa drought, like I mentioned, leaving over 26 million people with no access to food, with no access to water. How can people adapt to this kind of starvation if there is no food? If there is extinction of species, how can people or communities adapt to the extinction of these species? So there is a place whereby communities cannot adapt anymore. That's why there is a need for climate finance, not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation, and a separate fund to be put in place for loss and damage.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Vanessa. This actually brings me straight back to Florence. What is the role of the insurance and other financial players in exactly what Vanessa has just been talking about, the adaptation and mitigation, for example, for the Global South?
Okay. So maybe, if I may, on that notion of mitigation and adaptation, I think we need to approach this risk a little bit as we would for our own personal risk. So let's say you're going to your medical doctor and you discover you have high blood pressure. So first we need to do something, and I think there is now an agreement on this panel that we shouldn't stay silently doing just nothing. Subscribing a health insurance is part of the solution, but that's not good enough. So you need both medication and you need prevention measures. You need to change your lifestyle, you need to change your diet. And that's exactly what we need to do when it comes to climate risk. We need both. We need adaptation, changing, for instance, the nature of our crops so that they are more drought resilient, but also we need mitigation to get us all on the path to net zero. But the problem is it's a very complex risk because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a systemic risk, it's interconnected, every party is interdependent, and that's why we need to bring all the stakeholders on board. And this is about corporates, and I'm going to address the specific role insurance and the global financial community should play, but this is about corporates, changing our business model, getting on the path to net zero, driving innovation. This is all about us as individuals in changing the way we consume, the way we live. And this is about government in setting the right direction, incentive, but also protecting the most vulnerable population in terms of managing that change. And probably there should be some thinking somewhere about a global body to address what you've just mentioned, that inequality between the global north and the global south. So what we need to do is to radically transform, I mentioned earlier on, the way our societies and economies operate, and for that we need tremendous investment into new green technologies, into infrastructure. And here again, we have a big investment gap to finance carbon capture technologies, to finance hydrogen technology. Governments can certainly play a role in terms of sovereign debt emission to increase that green debt level, can catalyze private investments through risk sharing or through co-investment, for sure, and helping us as investor route as well those investments into the right projects. What we need as well is probably to put in place a global carbon pricing, because what we need ultimately is to reintegrate the cost of those externalities into our economic models, whatever they are, and into the cost of finance. And obviously, at some point, we must address implicit subsidies that needs to be eliminated. So insurer, we are both underwriters of risk, we are both, and as well as investors. And actually, these are two sides of the same coins, because our investment today are creating the balances or the imbalances that tomorrow we will need to insure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And speaking, I mean, you mentioned the net zero, commitments which both companies and countries have. And Sashi, I know that in India there has been an initiative for multiple years now where corporations contribute a proportion of their profits to so-called social responsibility or sustainability. Has this been impactful in any way, or is this investment gap indeed still very big?
It's a bit early to say. I mean, at COP26, India announced measures to increase renewable energy to achieve 500 gigawatts of total production capacity by 2030. And some of us rolled our eyes and said, can we possibly do this? It just seems almost impossible to achieve, especially since as of February this year, 2022, India has only installed 150 gigawatts of renewable energy, according to the government itself. So there's going to be a real problem. And we have to admit, for example, in a country like India, thermal power actually comprises 60% of our total installed capacity in power generation, and coal alone is about 50%. So how on earth do we suddenly turn overnight into matching these targets for net zero? We also said that the government said they would meet 50% of energy requirements from renewables, but that means it would have to actually increase even the planned 500 gigawatts to 700 gigawatts, because our total needs is going to be much higher than that 50% implies. So I've got a whole bunch of numbers for various countries. I won't bore you with them. But the fact is that many of these targets are not on track. And there's practically no government that can honestly say they're on course to fulfilling net zero objectives. I'm not saying we shouldn't have the objective. Of course we should. I mean, that old line from the 19th century Victorian poet, a man's reach must exceed his grasp, for what's a heaven for? But before we get to heaven, we're going to have to solve the problem on earth. And here, I think we'll have to be very realistic about what numbers people are going to... I saw one interesting detail from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They say that global CO2 emissions must be 18.2 gigatons in 2030 for the world to stay below 1.5 degrees rise in temperature. Now, some people just dismiss that as impossible, and I'll tell you why. If we take the global population in 2030, which we can estimate fairly accurately by now, and divide this amount of 18.22 GT, it would mean that the entire world has to be generating just 2.14 tons per capita of CO2 in 2030. And right now, almost nobody is. The poorest person in Vanessa's country or continent, the poorest person in my country, they will be certainly under 2.2. But the average person in the developed country is generating something like 8 every, and some places are much more. So we are, I think, setting ourselves targets which we're not going to be able to fulfill. And I say this without disparaging the importance of these targets, but just saying we've got to really be realistic about how much is required. I'd like, if I may, with your permission, Judith, to just follow up a little bit on one thing that Florence said about insurance, because I've been curious since we have an insurance person on the panel. I thought I'd look into a little bit of how this works, and certainly insurance companies can, redirect their asset allocation, their underwriting, their investments. You can redirect your capital from carbon-intensive industries and to industries that support climate action. You can disincentivize certain industries altogether. I'm told the coal industry, for example, 20 insurance companies are refusing to insure the coal industry. So there's one way you can actually make things difficult for them. In a country like India, that'll mean the government will have to get into the business of coal insurance, but that's another matter. And of course, the other thing you could do is to factor all this into your investment decisions and invest in specific sectors like renewables. Are you doing that? Just speaking of the industry as a whole, and if possible of your company, are you able to do that? Are you able to use your vast resources? I think you told me you have over $1 billion, or was it several $1 billion available, into investing in climate-friendly?
Yes, we do.
You do.
As an investor, so we do invest 200 billion globally across economies.
Wow.
We have decided to exit, and we do that as well for underwriting the most carbon-intensive activities, those that generate more than 30% of their revenues or volumes of activities from fossil fuels, for instance. We are setting ourselves to be carbon neutral on our investment portfolios by 2050. And already by 2025, we aim to be carbon neutral on 25% of our obligation and equity portfolios, 30% on our real estate portfolios. And we are using our investor voice to press for change. And that's why we are also picking the types of stocks, obligations, or equities where we have a degree of transparency and data about what they do, and where we can have a voice. We do the same thing from an underwriting perspective. We have stopped underwritten a number of industry. Obviously, we do accompany our clients through that process. But you're absolutely right. We are focusing as well on our capacity, our capital on those new sectors, such as renewable energy or electric cars.
So one thing you could do is also put some of your investment into companies in the developed world, in the global north, that are willing to transfer green technologies to the global south. I mean, the fact is, every time that the South says to the North, give us affordable technology, the governments, who are the ones they're negotiating with, say, it's not our problem. It's the private sector that invents these technologies. We can't tell them to not sell it to you at a big profit. Nothing more we can do about it. Well, here's something that you folks with your $20 billion can make a difference.
That's a fair point. And I must say that the main challenges we are facing into that is actually to be able to identify those projects. And that's why I mentioned you governments have a role to play in helping us find the right projects where we should direct our capital.
Yes, so I think what you bring up in the storyline that we're hearing, I mean, of course, the challenge is huge. Identifying the right type of projects or where to inject the money is very important. The theme of the St. Gallen Symposium this year is about collaborative advantage. I would like to give Vanessa maybe another opportunity to jump in. Vanessa, in your opinion, what are the ways that the different sectors, government, industry, and NGOs and activists can collaborate effectively?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the most important place of collaboration would be a place of demanding for climate justice and demanding for the investment in renewable energies or educating girls, and for people to understand that in whatever place they are at or in whatever position or role they are in, they can actually do something for the climate and also for the people. We know that not everyone will be able to go to the street to protest and demand for climate justice, possibly because they can't do it from their countries or because they don't feel comfortable going to the streets. But there are different ways that people can still demand for climate justice and support, the efforts of climate justice or climate action in general. For example, it can be in helping creating more awareness with the platforms that you have. If someone is a teacher that is educating their students about the environment, about what they can do to ensure that we have a better and more sustainable future. If the person is a lawyer or a judge, we've seen activists take, cases to court, cases against governments or fossil fuel companies. This is where the support of lawyers and judges is needed for climate justice. It can be insurance companies. We've seen insurance companies support oil pipelines or coal projects, and this is harmful to the environment. So there is a place for insurance companies known to support projects that are going to accelerate or increase the rise in global temperatures. So there is a place for everyone to really advocate for climate justice, for a better future for all of us. You just need to find, your part in whatever you're doing. That if, you're working in a bank or you, you own a bank, something like that, we've seen banks also invest billions of dollars in the fossil fuel industries, in oil pipelines, coal projects, gas projects. We've seen this. So there is a place for banks as well to really support the people and the planet. So there is a room for collaboration, and that room is for all of us to look towards one thing, and that is climate justice, and to find how, in our workspaces or in wherever we find ourselves, we can add the element of climate justice and support the people and the planet.
Thank you. With that, I would actually like to open for questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones in the room, which please I would ask you to use so that Vanessa can also hear and the online audiences can hear. Gentleman at the back.
Hendrik Leber from Germany. I'm so disappointed that nobody's trying to really work on the solution. The solution is simple. Put an upper limit on climate gas emissions, reduce the number year after year, like the European Union does. The price will go up. There will be alternative technologies, and the problem is solved within the next probably 20 years. And everything, if we talk about investment, I'm an investment manager, and if I take my money out of Exxon, the assets end up somewhere else. It's exactly the same assets, just move to another owner. It doesn't solve anything. Goodwill, good intentions don't solve the problem. The price does a limitation. That's a government thing and not a goodwill thing. So it's the only solution that works reliably. In terms of time frame, I did a calculation. We have about 50 gigatons left. We emit about 8.5 per year, so we have about 6 or 7 years if we go at the constant pace. If we go a slope down, it's about 17 years in my calculation to reach the 1.5 degree Celsius target. So a clear plaidoyer for government-controlled upper limits on emissions, and the problem solves itself.
Maybe I would ask Sashi to respond. Do you think this is the right solution?
I'm not quite sure. Once you start breaking that down, upper limit on emissions from what? Because again, it's going to vary from country to country, from industry to industry as to what's feasible and what's not. Take a developing country. I mean, in a country like India, we still have 300, 400 million people who have no electricity. Whereas in half the world, you can flick a switch on a wall and be bathed with light. There are lots of people who don't have that. So how do you then tell them that we're going to make electricity unaffordable for you when you haven't even got it yet? So we're just going to have to look at this holistically. There've got to be numbers that add up for the world as a whole. And as I said, with the global number I gave, that really works out to 2.2 tons per capita. And I'm not quite sure that that's even realistic to contemplate, and certainly in the global north.
May I just respond to the
Very
Sorry.
quickly, yes.
The price for for climate gas varies widely across the world. It's $5, I think, in China. It's about 80 in Europe. So we need a worldwide pricing system. And the technology will find a way. A company in Australia produces hydrogen, for example, for developed countries, and they can do this in Namibia, they can do this in Argentina. So the transfer is possible. The marketplace solves the problem. I'm sure of that.
Thank you. So one opinion is that market is all. A gentleman here in the middle with the glasses.
Hi. So a lot of the metrics that we use to measure climate risk or climate vulnerability are often developed by the global north, and that embeds a lot of systemic biases into how we measure risk. So for all of the panelists, what can we do to make a lot of the metrics that we use to measure climate risk and some of the aspects of the impacts of climate change, how do we measure those with a ruler that fits the global south?
Give us an example of a metric.
Say, like nat cat losses, like total losses due to natural catastrophes. Oftentimes, a lot of those impacts might not be well captured based off of their impacts on the global south, for example.
And Florence, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think this is the direction that we are taking lately, further to the recent scandals around greenwashing and the need for increased transparency, the need for clear metrics, but also the need to have aligned global norms. As an example, for us as a global corporate, we absolutely need to make sure that we have aligned norms across the various geographies and regions to really drive that change in our underwriting, but also investment portfolios. So I think you're absolutely right, and that's part of the focus of many of the governments and corporates these days, especially in Europe.
And Vanessa, do you also want to have an opportunity to answer this question?
Well, I think it would be something that I've already talked about, involving the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, because the way someone will understand climate change in the global north is not the same way that someone who has lost their farm or lost their business, or any child who cannot go to school because their school got flooded. These are completely different experiences. For some people, it may be that they're seeing changes, maybe in their heat, or I'm thinking of an example that I can use, but what I can say, there is a completely difference in the experiences, that people feel in the global north and also in the global south. So there is a need to really involve those who are on the front lines.
Time for one last question. And there are no ladies. Oh, yes, there's a lady over there with a question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. My name is Saskia, and I study environmental change at the University of Oxford. And I was wondering, specifically to Vanessa, but if the other panelists also want to comment, as the theme of this whole symposium is collaboration, and you've mentioned some of the failings in the global regime, the UN system, to collaborate effectively on this issue. How do you maintain faith in the UN system, in the COP system, or in general a global attempt to manage the climate risks? Thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Yeah, what I can say is that we've had 26 COPs, and we are continuing to see the rise in the global temperatures. And it's very hard to trust, in leaders or in governments or in conferences when the problem is only getting worse and when the people in your community are continuing to suffer the worst impacts of the climate crisis. But one of the things that I remember talking about when I got the opportunity to speak at COP26 was the fact that we do not believe that the leaders will give us the action that we are demanding for, but we want them to prove us wrong. We beg them to prove us wrong, to show that actually they can, do something. And to also give a most recent example, I remember at a meeting in Nairobi asking leaders, some of the ministers from the global north, whether they thought that the people who are suffering the worst impacts of climate change deserve their help. And many of them were quick to say yes. But when I asked whether there are countries who are willing to put money in place for loss and damage, there was a hesitation. So it's kind of very difficult, to when you see the gap between the actions or the promises and the words. So the faith or the trust and the hope is really in the people who are continuing to hold leaders accountable, who are continuing to demand for a sustainable future, who are continuing to believe that another world is not only necessary for all of us, but it's actually possible. So we do want the leaders, we do want the systems to prove us wrong.
Florence, I think you wanted to jump in.
Sure. So obviously we need to reinvent forms of collaboration across civil society, corporates, and governments. One of the things which I've seen develop recently, which I found extremely promising, is the development of coalitions. If you're taking the example of our very own industry, it's under the, UN umbrella. We have built a net zero insurance alliance, whereby 20 leading insurers representing 10-15% of the overall premiums globally. It's a beginning, it's not certainly an end, but are joining forces to define science-based, to your points, targets on how to decarbonize our portfolios from an underwriting perspective, but also commit to regular reporting on that decarbonization, and liaising also through that with various governments to implement science-based targets for our own industry, and making sure they help us as well through the indirect impact this can have on the certain communities, making sure we have a form of social justice. And I really believe in that power of coalition. That's true of insurance, but that's certainly true as well of asset management.
Thank you. And I'm afraid with that we're out of time, and I would like to thank all of my panelists, our panelists really, Vanessa, Florence and Sashi, for being here with us today. Thank you very much. A big round of applause, please, for... And to close the session, I would like to announce that the next session starts at 5 o'clock, which is the Essay Competition Award ceremony, and it will take place in the Aula, which is just kitty corner across from this building. Thank you very much.